Hey guys, today I want to show you a cool tactical blowout in a game that I played against, I don't know how to say his name, maybe Vanzig X. So I had the white pieces, and we start off, basically I end up going into Moosh, and I'm playing the Moosh against black going for Sayal. Uh, with black here, my thought is it doesn't really make sense to play a Sayal against a Mujana because black is never going to achieve this c5, c4 kind of push. So it makes more sense to say, okay, let's just go into a double Muj. But black's kind of playing a diehard Sayal, and I think the issue with that for black is that, okay, black is going to maybe play b5, but he's not actually going to be able to get a very good Sayal style attack because white is so well developed already on the Shah side. And meanwhile, the entire Furzian side is deserted, so I just took some space on the Furzian side. And so I think that's kind of the weakness of this system for black. We see knight to e7. So white is just going to continue h3, h4, and then g5. So basically, I'm going to just put a lot of pressure on this side. h3, b5. And yeah, here I play h4. White doesn't have anything to fear from this, so pawn to b4 after knight to a4. That's most likely the move. Knight to e2, of course, also playable, but I would have just played knight to a4. Black really doesn't get a lot out of this. It's how does black challenge anything? Maybe knight to b6, and then we just exchange. And here white is already well on his way to creating an attack after g5. And black has to expend so much time and energy to get anything resembling an attack here. And in the end, white can always just hide his king on c2 and play like rook b2, and it's not going to be any big deal. But white's attack is happening now, and black has to respond to it. So, so b4 doesn't work. If this first, then I would have just played king to c2, and that's pretty much going to be similar to the game. So understandably, black takes. There might be some different opportunities to mix it up. I mean, maybe f5 or maybe f to f7 would make more sense. Maybe even pawn to d5 would have been a try. So there were ways to mix it up, but black understandably goes ahead and takes a pair of rooks off because I do have to lose some time with this. And rook b7, king c2, f to f7. And black has succeeded in taking a pair of rooks off, which does make the game somewhat drawish. But as we see, my attack is already getting started, so I felt pretty good about this. So I played g5. Lots of different ways to react here. Maybe I'll do a lecture at some point on all the things you have to look out when one player plays g5 against this pawn break. Black plays h5, which is pretty solid. I think, long story short, taking this way strikes me as a bit dangerous after takes, pawn to f5, and then just rook here. It is true that black gets this this defensive setup, but black doesn't seem to have a lot of compensation for the fact that white's made progress, and white's just going to continue with something like knight to c3. Probably elephant comes up, pawn comes up, and trying to crash through on f5. So I don't know that I don't know that approach makes sense for black. And then f takes, h takes, and h5 is the other kind of approach, but here again too, right? So elephant's going to come to h3, and then e4 and f5 are going to be in the cards. So, and knight to h4 as well to help support that. So, I think pawn to h5 makes a lot of sense, but it does give up the g5 square, so I'm happy to just play takes, get some pressure along the file here, and then after knight takes, I play knight to g5, hitting this guy and forcing king to e8. Okay, so in terms of my plan here, Shatranj is a game of Furzans. I want to activate mine and leave this guy in the dust. That's how I'm going to get a big attack. So my long-term plan was to bring this guy into the fray and then hopefully try to get this break, force d5 up, and then I'm just going to waltz this guy into the e5 square. That's my long-term plan, and I do basically achieve that in this game, although, yeah, it's a long-term plan. It's not going to happen overnight. So fd2, black plays actively with knight to g4, and here I ended up playing knight to c3, right? Because I thought, well, okay, if the knight is no longer going to cover the e4 square, I'm going to have a way to get this knight in the game. Plus, white has some ideas of the c5 sacrifice followed by knight to a4. But here black plays knight to f5, and I'll admit I just kind of missed that black could play this and leave my pawn hanging. Now, never fear, of course, I have the option of going knight to f3 and guarding the pawn. But this really didn't appeal to me because I wanted to just try to work some sort of advantage, and that just looked way too much like I was going backwards for nothing. And rook to h1 didn't appeal to me either. Knight to g3 looks problematic, among other things, basically forcing rook g1, knight to f5, and to repeat it would make a draw. So after knight to f5, I came up with a different idea, and it's a really kind of bizarre long-term sacrifice. I said, well, it's only an h pawn, and I want to get a good Furzan, and if I get a good Furzan, that's totally worth a pawn, particularly a rook pawn. So I played bishop to h3, and of course black took, which is the right thing to do. There's no way for me to trap this knight. I cover all of the squares that the knight could go to, but there's no way to trap it. And I really didn't have any intention of trapping it. I just wanted to get active play and continue with my plan of making a good Furzan. And I just didn't really care. I figure, well, I'm down a pawn, but I've sidelined the knight. So I play bishop to a3 here. It might have been possible to just play here right away, basically a sacrifice, with the idea of d takes and then probably knight on c to e4. And going after this here, I didn't really go into it, and yeah, to be honest, I probably should have just played pawn to c5 right away. I don't really see any downside to that. D takes, knight on c to e4. Yeah, the knight will come into c5. Instead, I play bishop to a3 first. And I guess the downside to this is that if black wants to prevent c5, he could play c5 himself. And the idea there, knight on c to e4, attacking this, and then, maybe here, just this to stop elephant takes c5 ideas. So, maybe that was possible. It looks passive, but black is up a pawn. So that's one way that things might have gone. And it's not really clear exactly what white's breakthrough is, but it's never actually been entirely clear this whole game. The other thing after the elephant comes to a3, Black maybe could take some time and react in the center, so pawn to e5 was one thing I looked at here. And then if f takes, probably not this, which gives up the c5 square, but probably knight takes would be the way to go. And then probably, so if knight on c to e4, lots of stuff to calculate here. It's possible now there's a way for black to reactivate his knights, get his knights back into the game. It's possible here I would just play rook to f1. And it's also possible here, it's possible that rook to f1 is the right move with the idea of e takes and then rook takes. Activating the rook, maybe getting a check in this way. So, it's a very unclear position. And my sacrifice of the h-pawn really isn't based on anything other than getting this knight a bit sidelined and being able to continue my attack. But I got a bit of a lucky break. Black played bishop to h6, and this allowed me to play knight to e4 with tempo on the d6 square. Black played king to e7, but this ends up losing to a tactic. Black had to go back, actually. And after that, then I have the chance to play pawn to c5. And I would be happy with having achieved that outcome. Well, if I want, I can play this first. Well, no, I can't because I'm dropping e3. But I probably would have played pawn to c5 and I would have been happy with that structural outcome. But instead, black played king to e7, and this really allowed me an opportunity to exploit my better activity. I have a nice winning tactic here with knight takes f7. And the idea is after king takes, then I have knight takes d6 with this fork. So black finds kind of an only move, which is elephant takes here. And then I just took. And black played rook to d7. Okay. So I'll come back to this in a minute. Rook to d7. I think maybe looking at this, the way to play would have been knight to f3. And there's some really tricky tactical ideas here. So like rook to b1, I could play knight to d4 check. If king to c1, knight to e2, and black basically is able to force a draw here. And this exactly would probably just hang this rook. So, but yeah, it looks to me like black can force a draw by perpetual check. And in fact, he doesn't have to do that because he can play takes with check, and then king takes f7. And after knight takes, king up. Here, this actually looks pretty good for black, even though white has 3 minor pieces for the knight. Black has a lot of pawns, and the knights are really well placed. So black gets to have two good options there: take the draw or play for the win. So after knight to f3, so I think rook to b1 is a blunder. Rook to f1 would be another possibility. There, I kind of wonder, though, knight to d4 check, right? Because if king to c3, then knight e2 here, and that's just repeating. But if king back, then check followed by takes. So white would have to play king to c1 there. And then we might see knight e2 check. King up, followed by knight there would be a draw, so we might go this way. But then we have check, takes, and okay, this falls. Okay, and then after king takes f7, then it looks like white's winning because here in this position, white has managed to eat another knight, and we have the 3 minor pieces left over from that sort of tactical battle. So yeah, so it's possible then knight to f3. It's possible rook d1 here, and then king c1. This may be what holds the day, because here the knight's going to be hanging after rook to b1, king takes. So yeah, so that's interesting. And then of course the other move after knight to f3 to look at would just be rook to g2, kind of keeping the status quo. Knight to d4 check there could actually be met by king to c3, attacking the knight, and knight e2. Now this would be hanging. So after something like c5, this is going to give white time then to save his knight on f7. So knight to f3 is a try. I don't think it quite works. So rook to g2 being one possibility, and then maybe rook to f1 being a possibility. Of course, the other try is pawn to d5, just hoping that white will move away, and then black can grab this knight on f7. But that doesn't quite work either, because knight to c5 would hit this rook. And once the rook moves away, say to b8, then white has time to save this knight. So, so after takes, elephant takes here, black ended up playing rook to d7. Here I was able to save the knight, so black has now emerged, or white has now emerged up a furs and an elephant for a pawn. It's a large material advantage, but by itself is not necessarily winning. But here I switch back to the b file. I am going for checkmate against a black king. I'm going to play rook to b7 and try to get a knight in somehow. I want to get that mate. So combined here with some of white's good play, it's going to be winning. Rook to c7. Here I make a slight mistake. I play bishop to c5 check. And that just isn't going anywhere fast. White should just play c5. And then if d5, I have knight d6, and I'm trapping this guy pretty much, and the king has to come over here. But now black's totally tied down. So among other things, white can just start running the Fursan up, or he can try to come back with this knight and do something. But that would have been a cleaner outcome with c5. I play elephant here, and then after king to d7, it's not doing anything necessarily. But okay, my end goal was to get a good Fursan, so I bring the Fursan up, and I'm going to eventually get the c5 push. The Fursan is like the one piece that still needs to be active in this game, so I decide to activate it. So Fursan, activate. Now we're going to give it a try. Knight g2, king d2. I wasn't a fan of playing here and then giving black this pawn. Wanted to be a bit more cautious, so I play king d2. Black takes on c5. It's hard to see anything better. This knight is pretty well barred from entering the game, and this knight is also pretty well barred from entering the game. And the rook is tied down to the elephant, and the elephant has no moves, and the king is kind of tied down to the defense of everything. And the king doesn't have a lot of squares anyway, just d8 and e8. So, so that's why black played d takes c5. There's not really anything else. But after takes here, I got in knight e4 check, king e7, and now I'm able to finally get this Fursan in, fd4. So now the knights and the Fursan and the rook all work together to create a mating attack. So black takes here, winning that pawn, but I don't care about the pawn anymore because my Fursan is coming into d6 to give mate. Black plays rook to d7. Now I don't want to just grab here and then allow black a bunch of counterplay. Instead, I play fd6, shutting out the rook from its attack here. The king has to go back to guard this elephant. But now I have my mating attack. I play knight c5 check. Rook takes d6. But now the king and the rook are in an ideal square for a fork. Knight to f7 check is the winning move. You don't get quite full credit for knight to b7 check if that's what you found, because king to c7 hits this rook. And after takes, here, this, it's maybe it's winning for white, but white really isn't actually, white isn't even up material there, but actually king takes b7, and now black has all the chances to win. Black has an extra knight, so yeah, no points for knight to b7. That is not the way to go, but the knight fork on f7 is devastating, because after king to c7, with the idea of takes and takes, which keeps black in the game, white plays rook to b7 mate. So I was proud of this game. It was fun, it was interesting, and it featured one of those big kind of heavy mating attacks that are very common to modern chess, but appear less frequently in Shatranj, but when they do, often are quite geometric and very beautiful. So I'm looking forward to seeing Stakhanov make a study out of some interesting, knight covering this and knight covering this, just kind of interesting checkmate. So thank you to Vanzig X for a good game, and I will see you guys around.